In the previous chapter, we studied the model of supply and demand, and we talked a little bit about the shapes of market demand and market supply curves. In this chapter, we will study the more exact shapes of market curves, and we will study exact magnitudes by which quantity demanded, quantity supplied change when some factor changes. The name of this chapter is elasticity. In general, elasticity is the name for the magnitude of the relationship between two variables. We will start by studying the price elasticity of demand, which is the relationship between price and quantity demanded of a product. And later we will look at some other interesting forms of elasticity. We will look at other economic variables, and we will study the magnitude of the relationship between them. When we say elasticity, we should be careful to realize that it's elasticity gives us the percentage change in one variable in response to a percentage change in another variable. So when we discuss price elasticity of demand, we are discussing the percentage change in quantity demanded for a 1% change in the price of the commodity. Okay, let's illustrate a little bit. So last time we said that market demand curve is usually a downward sloping line, and we might be interested in studying the exact shape of this demand curve. We may want to know by how much exactly quantity demanded increases when price falls by a certain percentage. The reason why elasticity is a good measure of responsiveness between two variables rather than, let's say, a slope of the demand curve is that elasticity doesn't depend on units of the two variables. We can discuss the percentage change in the two variables without knowing if quantities are in units or 1,000 units or 1,000th of a unit of the commodity. And we don't have to know whether the price is in Korean won or dollars or in $1,000 and so on. So economists usually prefer to report elasticity as in the response between two variables rather than the slope of a curve between two variables. We will use the midpoint method formula for calculating elasticity because it will give us the same measure of elasticity regardless whether we are studying a change in this direction or a change in this direction on the graph. Right? Just to review, elasticity is the percentage change in, so price elasticity of demand is the percentage change in quantity demanded for a percentage change in price. You may think that between these 2 points, if we are looking at the change in this direction, we would find some particular percentage change in quantity, some particular change in price, But if we studied a movement from this quantity demanded to this quantity demanded, we would find a different percentage change in quantity and a different change in price. So using the simplest formula for elasticity, which is the percentage change in, let's say, quantity for a percent change in price, depending on which way we move on the graph, we would get a different measure of elasticity. And so what is the percentage change in quantity and what is the percentage change in price? Normally, we would, in the simplest formula for elasticity, we would take the difference between Q2 and Q1 and divide it by Q1, the starting level of quantity. And for percentage change in price, we would look at the difference between the original and final price and divide it by the original price. But notice that if we move on the demand curve in this direction or in the opposite direction, we would get a different, we would use a different starting quantity and starting price. So to avoid this problem, we will divide the change in quantity by the midpoint of quantities, and we will divide the change in prices by the midpoint of the starting and the final price. Okay. What determines price elasticity of demand? So in general, what determines the shape of a demand curve? We can say that the shape of the demand curve depends on the availability of close substitutes. Intuitively, if the price of a commodity increases, how easy is it for consumers to change their behavior to start buying a cheaper commodity and quit buying the more expensive commodity? The shape of the demand curve also depends on whether the good is a necessity or a luxury. Even if there are no substitute goods, you may think that consumers have different ways in which they can spend money. If a commodity is a necessity, then if the price of the commodity increases, the consumers might not be able to exit the market as easily. They may be forced to buy some quantity of the product. On the other hand, if the product is a luxury, if the price of the commodity increases, the consumers might exit the market. They might choose to buy a completely different commodity with their money, or they may decide not to earn as much money to purchase luxuries. They might decide to enjoy their life more, get more leisure time, not earn as much, and not buy commodities in the marketplace. So in other words, we will say that the shape of the demand curve or the price elasticity of a demand depends on the definition of the product and definition of the market. How hard is it to find substitute goods in the same time, space? So how many available substitutes are there? We will say that the price elasticity of demand increases the more narrowly defined the product is, the more widely defined the area or the time is. Intuitively, the more narrow of a category of the product we are talking about, the more available substitutes there are. If we talk about a particular kind of soda or particular kind of candy, we should think that there are other brands, other kinds of candy or soda or drinks that consumers can buy. If we were talking about drinks overall or food overall, we may think that it can be harder to find substitutes for food. The wider the market is, the easier for the consumer to find other stores and other products in the marketplace. The longer the time period, the more ability consumers have to think about their consumption choices, and the easier it is to come up with substitutes. Let's run through some examples of demand curves and observe what happens, what is the price elasticity of demand on these demand curves. Surprisingly, even if we have a simple linear demand curve, we would realize that price elasticity of demand varies along this curve. Exactly in the middle of this demand curve, we will have unit price elasticity of demand, which means price elasticity of demand equal to 1. And above this midpoint, price elasticity of demand will be greater than 1. We will say that the product is elastic, the demand for this product is elastic in this region, and it is inelastic in the region below the midpoint. If we had a perfectly vertical demand curve, we would say that this demand curve exhibits perfect inelasticity. This is a perfectly inelastic demand, because no matter what the change in price is, the consumers will not change their consumption level at all. And as the demand curve becomes flatter, we will say that price elasticity of demand increases on these demand curves up until the perfectly horizontal demand curve, which is the perfectly elastic demand curve. If the price of the product changed even a little bit, the consumers would choose to switch from some positive amount of consumption to zero consumption. If from some original price level the price decreased, we would say that the consumer will switch from some positive amount of consumption to desiring to consume an infinite amount of the product. And one interesting point to make about different price elasticities of demand is that depending on the price elasticity of demand, producers in the market will face different revenues. And if the price in the market changes, the revenues of producers will increase or decrease depending on whether the demand curve was elastic or inelastic. So let's look at an inelastic demand curve, and suppose that the price in the market changes from $1 to $3. In this case, we can see that the revenues of producers, and here we should think that revenues of producers are just quantity times price that the producer charges, the revenues of consumers increased. On the other hand, if we looked at an elastic demand curve, if the price in the marketplace increases, the revenues of producers will decrease. And this should be quite intuitive. You should think that we are comparing the relative width of these squares and the relative height of them. And with elastic demand curves, if we increase price, the percentage change in quantity will be greater than the percentage change in price, whereas with an inelastic demand curve, the percentage change in quantity would be smaller than percentage change in price. So we can summarize that with elastic demand curves, if the price in the market increases, companies get lower revenues than before, and with inelastic demand curves, companies' revenues increase when the price increases. Okay, so we have looked at the price elasticity of demand, and but price and quantity demanded are not the only two variables that we could study together. We might look at the relationship between income of the consumer and quantity demanded, or we could be interested in studying the relationship between prices of one product and quantity demanded for another product, if the two products are somehow related to each other. This would be interesting to study for complements or substitutes, the commodities that between which consumers are choosing. And finally, so these three measures looked at factors determining quantity demanded, but similarly we could look at factors determining the supply curve, and we could look at the price elasticity of supply. Let me summarize what we say about different elasticities. So we think that price elasticity of demand can be anywhere from 0 to negative infinity. Here, as a side note, we should remember that if the demand curve is downward sloping, then price elasticity of demand would always be a negative number, and it is only because economists are a little bit lazy that we will omit the negative sign on the elasticity, realizing that price elasticity of demand is always negative, and we can report it as a positive number. To be completely accurate, we would report it as a negative number. We would realize that there are strange cases when we could draw even positively sloped demand curve for given goods, for which price elasticity of demand could be positive. So to summarize what we know, we would say that if price elasticity of demand is between 0 and -1, we will say that demand is inelastic. If price elasticity of demand is exactly -1, we would say that demand is unit elastic. And if elasticity is smaller than -1, we would say that we have elastic demand. And if we have positive price elasticity of demand, we would talk about given goods. For income elasticity of demand, we could distinguish the cases when income elasticity of demand is positive, which happens for normal goods, and when income elasticity of demand is negative, which happens for inferior goods. And we could also distinguish the case when income elasticity of demand is greater than 1, which happens for luxuries, and case when income elasticity of demand is between 0 and 1, in which case the product is a necessity. And finally, I want to mention that for cross-price elasticity of demand, we can distinguish substitutes and complements. We would say that if the price of one commodity increases and as a result, consumers will buy more of another commodity so that the products are substitutes, we have a positive cross-price elasticity of demand. On the other hand, if an increase in the price of one commodity decreases quantity demanded of both commodities, which is the case of complementary goods, we would have negative cross-price elasticity of demand. The factors that determine the price elasticity of supply are similar to the factors determining price elasticity of demand. Again, the shape of the supply curve depends on the availability of different inputs in production. They depend on the definition of the product and market. They depend on the time period under consideration. And they depend on the possibility of new companies to enter the market. Finally, now that we have discussed the magnitudes of relationships between economic variables, we can look at some applications. First of all, at the end of this chapter, there are 3 examples. One is the example of a wheat market in which, during a particular season, there is an unusually high harvest of wheat. We may want to know what happens to the price of wheat if there is an unusually high harvest, and what happens to revenues of farmers in this industry. In general, we should, in examining these situations, we should start by looking whether the supply in the market or the demand in the market changed, which way the market curves shifted, and the goal in this chapter will be to estimate the magnitude of the change in quantity and price, and maybe the change in the revenues of producers. So in the wheat market, we would realize that because wheat is a necessity, the demand curve is fairly steep, and we should also think that the supply of wheat is inelastic because the quantity of wheat cannot be changed easily. It depends on weather, the amount of fields, and because of the shape of the demand curve, if the supply of wheat increases, we would notice that the price of wheat will change by a greater percentage than the change in quantity, and revenues of farmers will fall. As another example, let's look at the market for illegal drugs. There is, we start by looking at the demand curve for illegal drugs and the supply curve for illegal drugs, and we might evaluate 2 possible government policies dealing with illegal drugs. One possibility is to create penalties on producers of illegal drugs, which would effectively shift the supply curve upward. Another possibility is to start education programs whose goal would be to lower the demand for illegal drugs. And depending on the exact policy used, we would realize that for the same change in price of illegal drugs, we might observe a small reduction in the quantity of drugs if it was the supply curve that shifted, or we could observe a large reduction in the quantity demanded if it was the demand curve that shifted. In particular, because the demand for illegal drugs is fairly inelastic, we would expect that this policy may be more successful in dealing with the problem, the usage of illegal drugs. So in this chapter, we continued with the discussion of competitive markets. We looked at the exact shapes of market curves and the exact magnitudes of relationships among economic variables. And we can use this information in the following chapters when we discuss different government policies dealing with markets.